started. Welcome, glad you're here. I know there's a couple of different sessions that is going on, and I know you had to pick one session not to be at, so it was honored to be able to be here with me this morning. Just to give you a little bit of background to help just let you know me a little bit more. My name is Steve Silliman. I'm the pastor at State College Assembly. We have been in Pennsylvania a little over 6.5 years now at the church. Before that, we were in Michigan for about 12 years. My wife and I, we have 8 kids. My oldest son, Andre, is with me today. Since my dad knew he would have been. He gets that told him, you get to hear me at home, you get to hear me at church. I don't mind. It doesn't offend me if you're not here. I'm glad you picked me, Andre.
He does have to go home with you at some point.
Yeah. A couple other details, maybe just to help you connect. I was born and raised in Alaska. My parents were missionaries there. Spent some time in the military. I've lived in Oklahoma, Missouri, a lot of different places, but Pennsylvania, we've been here about 6.5 years, and just enjoy it. Enjoy getting to meet and know each one of you. This past fall, Jamie sent me an email, probably back before Halloween. Even he had sent me an email asking if I would consider teaching at one of these breakout sessions, and as I just began to pray over it and decided, I said, yeah. And I told my wife this past week, I'm like, it's weird that it's actually here, because it's been months and thinking about it, months and planning for it. But as he had asked me to speak, and he gave me the topic of starting over from failure, and I just began to pray and think about what do I want to talk about. And the pastoral thing, I think, is easy to think of a biblical character that I'm going to connect with, and that's going to be the person I'm going to talk about, and we'll just wrap into his life. And I think by default, the easiest person is David. And I think a lot of guys can relate to him. He's kind of a warrior, he's a tough guy, a lot of failures in his life. It's very easy to point to David as a man after God's heart. And David, when we look at him, he can serve as a number of good examples for us, because when it comes to overcoming failure or starting again from failure, he failed on a personal level. He failed morally. He failed in a very big way. Not only did he fail morally by way of sexual temptation, he had someone killed to cover it. So, I mean, I think that would count as a failure. Second thing, another way that he failed on the family level. He failed as a father. He had a son rape a daughter. He had another son try to steal the kingdom from him. I think that level of family dysfunction would probably qualify as a failure. Another one, he failed at work. He was a king, and we always think about David being this great king, this mighty king, and how great of a king he was, but we forget that he actually failed as a king. And he failed as a king in one key area towards the end of his life. His whole kingdom had been on trusting in the faithfulness and the strength of God, and there's a specific time where he's told not to count the troops. And he goes out and he counts the troops to kind of look at his own might and his own strength, and it says that ultimately he was conscience-stricken, and the nation suffered greatly. The amount of people suffered greatly, more loss there than in battle. So he did fail on a number of levels. And while David would be a good point, I'm not going to talk about David. He would not. I'm not going to talk about him, because we talk about him a lot, and there's a lot that we can relate to with him. But I found a different person in the Bible that I wanted just to look at for a little bit. And it's a person that, you ever read a story, and there's the main character, and then there's another person that's kind of a tag along to the story, and there's certain parts they surface, but there's a lot of times that are more in the background. That's the person. I'll tell you who it is in just a second. But many times when it comes to starting over from failure or just human nature in life, we want the quickest fix possible. We want the easiest solution. Now, is there anybody else that's with me? Does anybody do your own work on your cars? If I can, I'll try to fix it. There's not everything I can solve, but I'll try to fix it. And one of the things, like, I'll go and I'll think, well, this is going to take like 20 minutes. I just need to get a couple of quick screws off, easy to access, and I'm like, I'm going to get this off easy and fast, and then you get into it and you realize, wait a second, there's a bolt I don't see. I have to come in from underneath. I have to take this off. I have to do that, and I have another one that's stuck. And you guys know what I'm talking about. You're expecting it to be this long, and it takes this long in a day. And that's the nature of working on cars. But we want the quick fix. We don't want the long journey. I can remember a time when I was stationed in Oklahoma. My daughters, we just had 3 of our girls, just very small little infants at the time, little ones. I think my oldest at the time was maybe 3 or 4. and Teresa and I saved up and we bought a swing set. Now this was back before swing sets were made of wood and you had the, like they're built in permanently. This is the metal ones. You guys remember the metal swing sets? You leave them out in the rain for a few years, they become like, they're dangerous. So we had the metal swing set. It's like, if you're not familiar with them, they're an A-frame and then there's a beam across the top and usually a couple of swings down and a seesaw of some sort or a slide. And so I had a buddy come over and we were going to put it together. And because we wanted the fastest route possible, my kids wanted to play on it that day, we wanted to let them play on it. We pulled out the book of instructions, the manual, found a copy that was in English, and then set it out. And you see all the detailed instructions, and then there's a diagram. And the diagram kind of shows the arrows of pieces and parts going together. And for the most part, in the swing set, you're going to be able to spot which part. You know what a swing is. If you don't know what a swing is, you shouldn't be buying a swing set. So we're putting this thing together. We're using the diagram. We're snapping it all together, and we get it. So the A-frames up, the beams across the top, and we come to the point where we're going to install the swings and all the other things. And we like, how do we get these on? Because they won't go on. And we realized, in our haste to get to the end result as fast as possible, we made one small but really fatal error in our journey, and that was we installed the top beam upside down. How did you follow the instructions? There was 2 little bitty marks that we needed to turn the other way, so we spent a great deal of time pulling this thing apart, and by then we made it probably twice as long as it had to be because we wanted the quick route, and the quick route ultimately became the longer route because we didn't take time to pay attention to the details. And many times I believe in our own lives when it comes to starting over from failure, when it comes to journeying forward, when we look at the failure that we may face in life, or even you're living in the wake of others' failures, you're living in the wake of others' decisions, that when we look at those, we many times will want a quick step or 2 that we can take to get through it. We want 9 steps to deal with this struggle that I'm having, 9 steps to solve this, or 10 steps. And I'm not saying that those steps are bad. I'm not saying that those things are wrong, but there's one step on the very beginning that I just want to focus in on one of them. And that really comes down to the fact of understanding that as Christians, what we go through is not nearly as important as how we go through it. What you go through is not nearly as important as how you go through it. How you go through it will determine what version of you emerges on the other side. How you go through it, the things that you allow your mind to set on, the things you allow your heart to set on, will radically dictate how you emerge on the other side. So today, rather than giving you a list of things to do to start over from failure, what I want to do is really just focus in on one thing, and that is I want to focus in on the habits of our hearts, the things that we allow our hearts, we allow our minds to set on, and 4 specific things that we need to consider with what we choose to allow our thinking to settle on, or what we allow our hearts to meditate on. Now, the person that we're going to focus in on, I want to focus in on the story of Naomi before, and I've talked about her. When I first came to our church, it's about 6.5 years ago, I spoke on the story of Naomi. I'm sorry, the story of Ruth. And I spoke on the story of Ruth. Naomi kind of stuck out with me and hung in the back of my mind. And as I've looked at her, there's some things in our lives that I think we can learn from. And now I know you're thinking, you're at a man's conference. You're going to talk about a woman in the Bible? Yes, we are. I want to look at Naomi. There's 4 things that I think we can learn from when it comes to our hearts and comes to our lives. And so if you have your Bible, look in Ruth chapter 1. I want to read verses 6 to 22, just most of the first chapter, because it really sets the stage well, and then we can talk about it. And as you're turning there, as you're looking there, when you read the book of Ruth, it's 4 short chapters, really a short, tight story. And when we focus primarily on Ruth, and maybe it's Boaz. Boaz is the hero who saves the day. We can focus in on Boaz and the kinsman redeemer. We can focus on all those details. But in the journey, we look at Naomi, and she surfaces really big on the first chapter. She surfaces some of the last chapter and a little bit throughout the story. And we can see the big picture of how this whole story fits together. But to stop, and I think there's some patterns from Naomi's life that we can glean from for the matters of our hearts and what we focus in on. Now, to understand what Naomi's going through, to just kind of set the stage, and it's in the first few verses of the book of Ruth. we need to understand the journey that she's been on. So Naomi, her husband, Elimelech, and they have 2 sons, and there's a famine that hits the land of Israel, that hits Bethlehem. The famine is so severe that Elimelech, her husband, feels that the family has better odds moving away from home and into Moab. Now, moving from the land from Bethlehem into Moab, for us it might sound like, well, I'm moving from Pennsylvania to Ohio. It's not necessarily how it was. There's only a 50-mile difference. But the land of Moab, the Moabites, if you look in the Old Testament, the Moabites, specifically in this day, the Moabites were great enemies of the nation of Israel. The Moabites were thorns in the side of the nation of Israel. They led them astray. All sorts of things that they continually did that they were enemies. So to consider this move of 50 miles, to put it in perspective for today, it wouldn't be like moving from Pennsylvania to Ohio and moving in enemy territory, unless maybe it's like college football weekend or something. But then it would be. But if you're not, you're moving, where a better perspective would be taking it and moving from Pennsylvania into Iraq. I mean, that's the kind of culture shift that they're going through, that this family's going through. And so Elimelech uproots his family, moves them to Bethlehem. Moves them away from Bethlehem into Moab, and then they're there for 10 years. And while they're there, here's the things that happens that Naomi is ultimately dealing with failure, and really she's living in the wake for the most part of someone else's failure, which is where I think oftentimes we can find ourselves, as well as our failures of our own making. Number one, they're away from home. They're living in enemy territory. Some in the nation of Israel will look at that alone as being compromised, that they've left their homeland. Secondly, her sons marry Moabite women. If you're familiar with Jewish culture, they are forbidden to marry outside of individuals who are part of the Jewish nation. So her sons fail. Then her husband dies. Not only does her husband die, then her sons die. So not only has her husband died, her sons have compromised their belief by way of who they marry, and then her future dies. Her sons die off. And so you're looking at someone who's kind of in a very difficult place, now has 2 daughters-in-law who are of foreign descent, kind of trying to figure out what to do. And that's kind of where we pick up this story. Look with me in Ruth chapter 1, verse 6. It says, when Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go back, each of you, to your mothers at home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud. And she said to her, we will go back with you to your people. But Naomi said, return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you from me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. Then the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, can this be Naomi? Don't call me Naomi. Now the word Naomi, the Hebrew name Naomi means pleasant. She says, don't call me Naomi, she said. She told them, call me Mara. The word Mara the name Mara means bitter, because the Lord Almighty, and the name she uses for Lord Almighty is El Shaddai, meaning all-powerful one. So she says, the Lord Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law. arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Now, have you ever noticed there are certain people you can be around that, regardless of what they may be going through, maybe you've met someone, you're interacting with them, and there's just such a pleasant personality about them, there's just a pleasant way about them, that later you find out that they're walking through perhaps one of the most tragic times of their life, and you're like, I didn't even know that. I mean, it didn't even come across with them, that what they're walking through does not taint their spirit. But then there's others that when they're walking through something, that whatever they're walking through has a way of getting deep into their hearts. And that it begins to become the filter or the lens that they're viewing everything through. That whatever they're going through, what is shaping their heart, it's shaping their perspective, it's shaping the things that they say. I really feel like from Naomi and her journey back to Bethlehem, we get a sense that what she's just been through, which is tragedy, but we get a sense that from this tragedy and this failure, that it has begun to shape her heart. And so what I want to show you is just 4 things really quickly from Naomi that I think we can consider. 4 things to consider when it comes to what we allow our minds to focus in on and what we allow our hearts to focus in on. The first one is what we rehearse in our hearts will always give birth to something. What you rehearse or what you allow your mind to settle on will always produce something. It may not be something you want, or it may be something you want, but it always traces back to what you've allowed your mind to set on. This past fall, at our church, one of the series, we did a series on clean slate, and having fresh starts in our lives. And one of the things we talked about was our thinking. And the verse that I referenced was 1 Peter chapter 1, I think it was verse 15. And in 1 Peter chapter 1, 15, Peter says, he says, depending what translation you read, but one translation will say, it says to prepare your mind for action, or to ready your minds for action. If you have the King James Version, I think that one in that specific verse holds a little more true to the words, to the original wording, and it says to gird up the loins of your mind. And what he's talking about is that in that culture, much like you see in the Asian culture, they had the long robes that they would wear, and they would go all the way down to their feet. Mm-hmm. And so when a race would come, when 2 individuals would come and be ready to run the race, if they were to run with their garments completely hanging down around their feet and they started to run, they might get the best start possible, they might get a jump, they might be faster than their opponent, but somewhere along the way their garments are hanging down and it begins to trip up their legs and they fall. And so when he says to gird up the loins of your mind, the word he uses for gird is for that runner. When you're there to take their robe that's hanging down, they reach between their legs, they grab the robe, they pull it up, and then they tuck it into their belt. So it kind of becomes almost like these baggy trousers. And he says that to gird up your loins, that's what the runners would do, so then they were able to run appropriately towards the destination, towards the finish line, with the speed that they had. If the garment became loose and dangled down around their feet, it would trip them up. And so when Peter says to gird up the loins of your mind, he's not talking about the garment you're wearing, he's talking about your thinking. And he says to recognize the loose ends in your thinking that are ultimately shaping and hindering where you're going in life. So if you're dealing with overcoming failure, overcoming struggle in your life, what he's talking about, he says take time. What Peter's talking about is take time to recognize and address those loose ends of thinking, because in the end, they're going to produce something. Whether it be impure thoughts, whether it be thoughts that are focused on failure, whether it be whatever that inward dialogue is that you continue to allow to run in your mind, that is always going to shape how you come out on the other side of whatever you're facing. It'll always produce something. We get a sense of this with Naomi in the story here, just reinforcing that what we rehearse in our heart will always give birth to something. Look in verse 13. She is talking to her daughters-in-law, and she says, "No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand is turned against me." From her perspective, she tells herself, God's against me. And the distance between Moab and Bethlehem is about 50 miles. The average person, I'm just walking at a normal stride, the average person can cover about 2,000 steps, cover 1 mile in about 2,000 steps. So for these two ladies to travel, it would take a total of 16 to 17 hours for a person walking. 2,000 steps per mile, about 16 to 17 hours to cover 50 miles. For two women traveling alone, most likely they would not have traveled at night. They probably would have jumped into some caravan or something so that they weren't out even on the day alone. So we can assume probably 2 to 3 days for these women to walk. So if you do the math, 50 miles, roughly 100,000 steps that Naomi has taken. When you see what she tells her daughters-in-law in Moab just before they're leaving, it says, It is more better for me than for you because the Lord's hand has been against me. So that's her departing message as she leaves Moab. Then she walks 100,000 steps, and when she arrives in Bethlehem, listen to how she greets the people who greet her. She says, don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara. Don't call me pleasant. Call me bitter, because the Lord Almighty has made my life bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me pleasant? The Lord has afflicted me. The Lord Almighty has brought misfortune on me. Do you know what I think Naomi did in those 100,000 steps? Is she allowed her mind, and she continued to rehearse in her mind all the ways God had wronged her. She rehearsed in her mind all the ways that life had gone wrong. She rehearsed in her mind how her life was being affected by someone else's failure. She rehearsed in her mind all the ways that things did not go the way she wanted. Whatever you allow your heart and your mind to cycle through and to continue to retell yourself will always produce something in your life. I mean, she even goes so far as to change her name. Can you imagine, just picture it with me for a second, if I had had a bad day this morning, if let's just say on my way to church to meet the guys in the van, we had a car wreck and my car was totaled, and then I had to walk, my son and I had to walk the rest of the way to church, and a car drove by a puddle and splashed me, and I mean, just you name the perfect scenario for a horrible morning. And so then I'm standing here and you walk in and some of you greet, oh, hey, are you Steve? I say, well, my name used to be Steve, but don't call me Steve anymore. Call me Bad Day. Or, don't call me Steve anymore. Call me Big Failure, or whatever it is. Naomi goes so far as to change her name. You talk about personalizing and owning a failure in life. How many times do we personalize and own a failure in life that we become to the point that while you may not change your name outwardly, you've changed your perspective inwardly. And you've continually allowed your mind to replay again and again. Think about it when you drive home, like if you're driving home from work, or you're driving a distance and you're alone in the car and you're not listening to a podcast, or you're not listening to music, and you're just sitting in silence. As you're sitting in silence, a lot of times our minds begin to think of all those things. You kind of start, the conversations you start having in your mind, the things you start telling yourself, the things you need to solve. But if you're going through a failure, or you're going through a struggle, whatever that it might be, or a challenge, maybe it's even a challenge with someone else, that challenge, that difficulty, that failure that you're living with kind of sits front and center in your mind, does it not? And as it sits front and center in your mind, that becomes the one thing that you're thinking about. And as that's the one thing that you're thinking about, that one thought begins to shape your feelings. And as it begins to shape your feelings, any other thought that comes that's connected or similar to that thought, your feelings now affirm. So you've created an environment and an atmosphere in your mind that now affirms and welcomes thoughts that affirm the first thought you had. Does that make sense? And so we begin to create this pattern, and so if we allow our minds to continually feed and focus on these improper thoughts, these wrong thoughts, even thoughts of failure, thoughts of how you've missed it, thoughts of how you can't recover from that, or how you're going to let people down, all of those type of thoughts. When you continue to allow your mind to settle on those things, it will always produce something in your life. It will always shape pieces and parts of your life. I really suggest that Naomi could have emerged in Bethlehem a completely different person had she chose to rehearse something differently in her heart from Moab to Bethlehem. One translation, I think most individuals have a default psalm that you'll go to and you'll camp out in, and that's just kind of like, that's your psalm. For me, mine is Psalm 37. I absolutely love Psalm 37. Psalm 18 is another one. Psalm 37:3, one translation, Psalm 37:3, it says, feast on his faithfulness. It says, feast on his faithfulness. And so when I look at my life, when I might be facing a challenge, whether it be a challenge at home, a challenge at work, a challenge with whatever it might be, that I have to choose what I'm going to allow my mind to feast on. Am I going to focus on the things that are happening, or am I going to choose to feast on the faithfulness of God through it? I know when it comes to fitness and things, there's a phrase that people use, and they'll say, you are what you eat. That you are what you eat, and that's if you're wanting to get fit, then you probably shouldn't be eating fast food, and if you don't care about getting fit, then fast food's not going to matter. That you are what you eat. I would say that you are what you eat, or you are what you think. Is kind of maybe another line that I've heard before. But what you choose to allow your mind to feed on is going to be a big impact on what is ultimately produced and the results in your life. I really believe that those broken spaces, those challenging spaces in life, They are critical spaces for our hearts that God can use to develop and shape. And whatever may come our way, well, there's things we might look at and say, well, God, you should protect me from this. You should have protected me from this failure in that person's life. You should have protected me from that. Whatever that might be that you put into that category, whatever God chooses not to protect us from, he will purify us through. Whatever he chooses to not protect you from, he will use to purify and develop and cultivate your heart for greater dependence on him. I really believe that when it comes to, and you can see the story of how God works in people's lives in Scripture, and it's God's perspective on how he works in life, how he works through people, how he works in circumstances. God never wastes a failure. He never wastes a failure. And I think we waste our failures and our struggles because of what I've already talked about when it comes to our thinking. But God never wastes a failure. One of the books that I'll recommend for individuals from time to time is called The Land Between. And the subtitle is The Land Between, Finding God in Difficult Transitions. And he's talking about the Israelites when they left captivity before they've entered the promised land. And it's kind of like that whole space in between. And listen to what he describes. He describes those failures, those struggles, those challenging places. He calls it the land between. And he says this: is it possible for the best version of you to emerge while you're passing through a season of profound disappointment, unnerving chaos, or debilitating pain? The land between can be profoundly disorienting. It also provides the space for God to do some of his greatest work in our lives. Many seasoned spiritual advisors propose that this is the only space in which radical transformational growth occurs. God intends for us to emerge from this land radically reshaped, but the process of transformational growth will not occur automatically. Our response to God while in the land between is what will determine whether our journey through this desert will result in deep positive growth or spiritual decline. People often quote a common proverb in time of pain and tragedy: time heals all wounds. I do not find this statement to be necessarily true. Some people heal over time, while others become deeply embittered and acidic. The land between usually forces us to choose one way or the other. The conditions can prove so harsh that there seems little room for neutrality. While offering us a greenhouse for growth, the land between can also be a desert where our faith goes to die, if we let it. The habits of our hearts that we foster in this space, our responses and our actions and reactions, will determine whether the land between results in spiritual life or spiritual death. We choose. And what he's talking about is really reinforcing what I've already been saying, is what we choose to allow our minds and our hearts to settle on will ultimately dictate a lot of the direction of where we end up. Second thing, rather quickly, that I just to point out. So the first one is that whatever we allow our hearts and our minds to meditate on and settle on, it will always produce something. It'll always produce results. Secondly, what we rehearse in our hearts shapes our view of God. What we choose to allow our hearts and our minds to settle on and rehearse will always shape our perspective of God. In verse 20, we've already read it once, but verse 20, she says, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter." When she uses the word Almighty, as I mentioned, she uses the name El Shaddai, which means all-powerful. Really, the way she says it is she says, God may be all-powerful, but he's not shown himself all-powerful for me. She gives God, really, she gives a negative testimony to God's faithfulness. She chooses to view God through her brokenness. She chooses to blame God for the affliction. She chooses to blame God for the misfortune. She says God doesn't care. In fact, she goes on to accuse God of actually working against her. She says that God, really saying that God is disconnected from her struggle. See, from her vantage point, when she looks, she doesn't see anything of what God's doing. She doesn't see the timing of how he's working, and I'll point that out in just a second. But to her vantage point, God's been absent, God's been silent, or even God's been negligent. So what we choose to allow our hearts and our minds to settle on will always, in some way or another, either positively or negatively, will shape our view of God. That it has a powerful piece in that. A verse I wanted you to see that helps see this is in James chapter 1. If you look in James chapter 1, verse 16 through 16 and 17. He says, "Do not be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He says, don't be deceived in your thinking about God. Don't be deceived in how you perceive God to be. And then he uses two words and then implies a third one. The first one is he says every good, and he says every good and perfect. Now, when you and I use the word good, we recently had Valentine's Day. And so if you have a wife in your life or someone significant in your life, and you went and you gave her a box of chocolates, or perhaps she gave you a box of chocolates, you know that in that box of chocolates, when you open it, there's all sorts of different little chocolates that are laid out. You know what I'm talking about? And when you open it, some of those, you may not know what they are. When I was little, they didn't put guides in them, and so you just buy it, and it's like, oh my goodness, it's nasty. Now, like the lids, there's some guides and things in it. But if you don't have the guide and you're looking, you can open up, and you can pull out one piece of chocolate, and you go to bite it, and it might be good. Like maybe it's full of caramel or full of something that you really like. You can go grab another one that looks almost just like the one you ate, and you bite it, and you're like, this is nasty. Here's what I'm talking about. So, but when someone gives you that box of chocolates, and you might eat, let's say you eat 75% or 90%, and then there's the 5 or 10 pieces you just don't like whatsoever. If that person, you were into that person, you're going to go up to that person and you're going to say, man, that box of chocolates was good. That was good. Thanks for giving it to me. So we use the word good, and we use it kind of like in a general sense. Like, well, that was mostly good, so hey, it was good, right? When the Bible uses good to talk about God, so specifically in James, it says every good and perfect gift. When it uses the word good to talk about God in James, it speaks of moral excellence and soundness. That means that what he does, what he permits, his activity in our lives, that it's good and consistent throughout. That means from top to bottom, left to right, from bottom, every bit of it is completely and fully good. God doesn't hand you a box of chocolates with 99 that are really good and one that's really bad. That's what he's talking about. And that's where I say that God can take and redeem every failure and every struggle, because he's working it into the goodness of who he is and how he works it out. We may not see the results right now, and you might look at that, and you might hear how I describe the goodness of God and the soundness of the goodness of God. And you might take that, and you might want to put that against your life, and put that against your failure, or put that against your struggle. And so you'll put that up as a lens against your failure and say, okay, you're telling me that God is completely, fully good. How does that work on the failure that I'm facing? And that's where the second word comes in. He says every good and perfect. He says perfect. The word that he uses for perfect speaks of complete, speaks of big picture, speaks of the whole story. It's not meaning like half the story. It's not meaning 3/4 of the story. It's meaning complete story. So if you're in a place right now where your perspective of God is that he has not been good, your failure, whether it's someone else's failure you're living in the wake of, or a failure that you're walking through, you might look at that and say, well, I haven't seen God's goodness in it. Then I would just say, well, then you haven't waited till the end of the story yet. Yeah. You haven't seen the complete story. Yeah. I think a great example that helps pull this in is, you'll see people with like a needle point, like stitching. And so they'll put in the needle point and they'll stitch from one side, and usually there's a pattern or something. And on one side of the needle point, you see this beautiful picture that's beginning to emerge, whether it be a horse or a barn or something that they're stitching together. But if you look at the needle point from the other side, it is a tangled mess. There's string hanging out. You might look at it like, what in the world are you making? But you're looking at the wrong side. And I think many times in our lives, we get confused which side we're currently living on. That many times we're living on the side with all of the strings that are currently hanging out. There's a lot of pieces that are making sense. And we can't see the big picture from God's perspective on how he's knitting it together and pulling it together. And for some of us, that big picture, it might mean that we're going to trust God with the big picture until we see it in eternity with him. That's just the nature of life. But it's saying that even though I may not see it from my vantage point, I can trust God that you are good and you are perfect. And then the third idea that he uses in James, he says that God is the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. That when I stepped in the building this morning, the sun was in a certain position, the shadows were leaning a certain way. When I leave this afternoon, because the sun has shifted, the earth has shifted, the shadows have shifted. This says that God is consistent regardless of the position in your life, and in your pain, and in your failures, and your struggles. Regardless of where you're at, God doesn't shift like the sun throughout the day. But he's consistent. He's consistently good. He's consistently perfect. And when we encounter spaces and patches in life that don't make sense, that we struggle to make sense of, we have to make sure that we don't let those experiences shape our view and our perspective of God, but we have to choose to let what we know to be true about God shape our perspective of how we're walking it through. What we choose to allow our minds and our hearts to focus in on and meditate on will have a huge impact on how we emerge on the other side. And so I really believe that when we allow that truth of who God is, His goodness, His perfection, we allow that truth to permeate our lives, regardless of what you may face and what you may encounter, that is where you always default to. You say, I don't make sense of this right now, but I refuse to allow patterns and thoughts in my heart and in my mind to counter anything other than who God is. That I may not make sense of this, but I trust in that God is good, and I trust that He's faithful. And I get a sense that Naomi's friends kind of try to help her with this in Ruth chapter 4, verse 14. This is at the end, towards the end of the story. It says, the women said to Naomi, praise be to the Lord. So Ruth has gone out, she's found Boaz, and you just see all of this God's blessing in her life. The women say to Naomi, praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May He become famous through all Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you. And when I look at that, so we see how Naomi pulled into town. She pulled in under a very negative cloud, kind of an Eeyore attitude. God's wronged me, life has wronged me, all these things. Her friends are still trying to lift her up and getting her to see, and they're saying, look, God's not left you empty-handed. From your perspective, where you were at, you felt He left you empty-handed, but now as you advance, you'll see He hasn't left you empty-handed. He's still been faithful. And so I think it's a good reminder that what we choose to allow our heart and our mind to meditate on will always shape our view of God in some way or another. Third thing, just to give you quickly, the third thing, what we rehearse in our heart, what we allow our minds to think on, will always impact the relationships around us. It will always impact the relationships around you. The things that you allow your heart and your mind to focus in on will eventually spill out your mouth. And they will begin to impact those relationships around you. When you look in the story of Ruth, and we won't read the verses, but in the very beginning chapter, when she's having her conversation with her daughters-in-law, Naomi has arrived at who she believes God to be based on her circumstances. That He's been unfair, He's been cruel, He's not been faithful. And I want you to see what happens with one of her daughters-in-law in verse 14. So Naomi has already said, God's not been fair to me. And she tells her two daughters-in-law, don't wait for me, go back. And she specifically says, go back to your gods. In other words, she says, mine's not been good enough, so go find a different one. In verse 14, she says this, as they wept aloud again, then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. So Orpah, the other daughter-in-law, at this point in biblical narrative, she walks out of the story and she walks out of the pages of Scripture. We never hear from her again. That because of how she allowed the things that happened to her to shape her perspective of life, she allowed her heart and her mindset to be formed by that. She allowed her perspective of God to be shaped by that. Ultimately, it began to shape the relationships around her. One translation, when it's talking about how Ruth is interacting with these daughters-in-law, they're wanting to go with her. It even says that they came to the road with her before she leaves here in what we're reading. But one translation says that Naomi went so far as to argue with them. She's arguing with them. Don't come with me. Don't trust my God. He's not been faithful. Don't come with me. That she's arguing with him. That it's this matter of what she chose to do. She chose to misrepresent God to those around her. And in the process, she forever changed the trajectory of their lives. And so it's realizing the power of your words that is shaped off the power of your perspective. How you're viewing your perspective, how you're viewing your failure, how you're viewing your life, and then the words that flow out of that. In Proverbs, several times, in James it talks about the power of our tongue, the power of the things that we say, the things that we share, the things that we let flow out of our minds. And I think that we have to realize that the power of our words and the things that we allow our hearts to rehearse will always impact those around us. The immediate place is in your home. What you rehearse, the real you often surfaces at home. And so what will flow out of your mouth and who you are is going to shape your children, it's going to shape your marriages, it's going to shape your life, it's going to shape your perspective, it's going to shape your workplace, that is going to shape every part of your life. And I really believe when you look at Paul, Paul is a great example of this in the Old Testament or the New Testament. Paul went through shipwrecks. He was falsely accused. He was stoned and left for dead. He was flogged. He was beaten. He was jailed. But you never get a sense of that getting into penetrating his spirit. Instead, he was always speaking life into people around him, and he was always surrounding himself with people who could speak life into him. And that really brings me, I think, to the second part of this, of realizing your perspective, the things you allow your heart and your mind to settle in on, will always shape the relationships around you. Because I believe the reverse is also true. That if the power of your words impact those around you, is to keep in mind the power of those around you, their words will always impact you as well. Just the impact of those words and how they will shape. There's a time in John chapter 11, and I'll give you the last one, we'll wrap up. There's a time in John chapter 11 where Jesus is headed to Judea, and in Judea, earlier they had tried to kill Jesus. They didn't like him, they tried to kill him. And so Jesus leaves with his disciples. And then he decides, he's just feeling God's direction, he's being led back. And as he's leading back, Thomas's words, one of his disciples, Thomas says, "Let's go with him so that we can die with him." And I look at that, and that's a perfect example of the type of people not to surround your life with. That he's speaking this negative, he says, "Well, let's just go with him, he's going to die, let's just go with him anyways." And so I think I take that, and I look at that, and I think just don't surround yourself with Thomases. Surround yourself with people like Paul, who will continually be lifting and encouraging and pointing you forward. And then the last thing I'll give you is what we rehearse in our heart always impacts our outlook. What you choose to allow in your mind and allow your heart to settle on will always impact your outlook. What we allow to go on inside of us will ultimately shape how we go on the outside. I want you to see the timing of God's provision. In all of this complaining where Naomi's at and what she's not seeing in Ruth chapter 1, look at verse 22. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. She arrived at the exact time that she needed for them to have provision. She didn't know at that time that there was a kinsman redeemer. She didn't know about Boaz. She didn't know about all those pieces. What she needed was food on the table. And God had her leave Moab. Had she delayed, she would have missed the harvest. Had she left too early, she'd been waiting for the harvest. Instead, she arrived in Bethlehem right as the harvest was beginning, and according to Jewish laws, they were permitted to go out and to glean the fields and the leftovers and to use that. That God had guided her and provided for her even when she was accusing God of being unfaithful. And really in the end, when you see in the story, it's not Naomi, it's Ruth who recognizes the provision of God. It's Ruth who goes into the fields. It's Ruth who the story begins to unfold through. And it's just a continued reminder of what we allow to go on the inside of us will always shape how we go on the outside. It will always shape our perspective. And I'll have people who from time to time in talking with them about work challenges or church challenges or whatever that might be, is they buy into the idea that change of location and change of scenery will change things. And I had a mentor in life who used to say this way, so I'm telling people, where you go isn't the change you need. And he used to say it this way, he'd say, wherever you go, there you are. That's right. That you, and I've said this at church this way, is that you always bring your biggest problem in the doors with you.
You better believe it.
And you always bring the biggest problems in your door at home. And it comes back to what we're allowing our heart and our mind to focus in on and what we're allowing our thoughts to settle in on. The longer we look at our challenge, the longer we look at our pain, the longer we look at our brokenness, the smaller God will always look. But the more we begin to let the perspective of who He is define how we go through things, it will always produce different results than if we let how we go through things shape our view of God. So I have a few more minutes. I'm going to close there and just open up for questions. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't have a question, but I have an observation.
Sure.
That type of person is what John Bevere calls spiritual vagabonds. They go from church and burn bridges. They go to one church and burn bridges, then they go to another church and burn bridges, then they go to another one or two churches and finally come to yours and they bring their baggage with them. And they're never happy wherever they go.
Yeah, that's true.
And rather than sitting there and honoring their leadership and toughing it out even though they don't understand it, the grass is always greener at the other church.
Right,
And so
Right.
they just kind of make a circuit, and pretty soon they got no place else to go.
right.
So,
And that's true. I had a time when I was a youth pastor that I had a mom come and sit with me, and she was frustrated with me, with her son. Her son was in the youth ministry, and as we're talking, her son, the story comes out, and she's expressing her frustration with me about her son, about me with her son. But in the story, I knew this piece, and this continued to come out. So her son had problems with the teacher at school, so then he had problems with the principal. Because he had problems with the principal, he was now kicked out of school and was in a different program. He had problems with that program, he had problems with the law, and he had problems with his parents, and he had problems with me. And so she's pointing out to me, and then finally I just told her, I stopped and I said, I don't know the teacher, I don't know the principal, I don't know the police officer, I don't know all these, but what's the common denominator in all these people? It's your son. And helping her recognize that that's the problem. It's not the leadership around him, it's that he's the problem, and he's to deal with some things, so.
sounds very familiar.
Yeah. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? Yeah.
Going back to what was just said, one former pastor made the statement is, when you find a perfect church, don't go to it, because it won't be perfect anymore.
Yeah, it's true. It's really true.
True.
One thing that I would add, and then we'll wrap up, is, and if you have questions, I'll hang around both now and then even after the main session. Something that I'll encourage individuals to do, specifically when it comes to those thoughts, because I think most here will know what that thought is, or those type of thoughts that will come and try to begin to shape and define your life and really define how you go forward. What I encourage individuals to do is to find I call them kind of like you're sorting your shield verses, for lack of a better word. And the sword verse would be one specific verse, because sometimes our minds you get overwhelmed with whatever it is that's coming at you, and you're scrambling. And many times you're several steps into it before you realize you're in it. And so, and this applies to all across the board to all sorts of things, all sorts of thinking. And so to number one, pray for wisdom and discernment to recognize when those thoughts first come, and to not recognize them as your own. And then secondly, to have one specific verse, not because we can say, well, there's lots of verses on how you think, and there really is. But to have one specific verse that when a thought comes, that's the verse you're going to go to. You're going to pull it out and you're going to begin to focus on that, because many times we will focus, even if you recognize the thought, you'll focus on the thought, and because you're focusing on the thought, all you're doing is giving that thought more dominance and more priority in your mind. So instead of focusing on the thought is recognizing, changing what you're thinking on, and that's the promises of God. So one key verse for me that I use is kind of like my sword verse. It's the quick one I'm going to just grab and I'm going to use to go at something that might challenge me in my thinking. Is the 2 Thessalonians 3:3. It says, but the Lord is faithful, and he will strengthen you and protect you from the evil one. And so I'm like, but the Lord is faithful, but God is faithful, but God is faithful. And so then when you have that one verse that you're going to use to challenge those thoughts immediately, then the second thing is what I call kind of your shield verse, is that when you recognize that thought has been disarmed, then what you can begin to do is your second verse is that shield verse, it's the second verse, you just begin to remind yourself of the faithfulness of God, how he protects you, how he watches over you. When you look in, and I don't think I said this in here, I think I said it in the earlier session. When you look in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 5, it's talking about the Christian and their thinking. This is take captive every thought. And it's a reminder that as a follower of Jesus, you have a God-given right to control your thinking, not to be controlled by your thinking. Those are two very different things. To recognize the difference of what's happening. And the verses prior to that, what it talks about is it says the authority that God gives us, and really it's the authority of his word, taking God's word and making it active in our lives, is that it demolishes the works of the enemy. And that's the lies, the things that he wants to bombard your minds with. So. Anything else? Well, what I'll do is I just want to pray over you, and then I'll dismiss you, and I'm around if you have questions, comments, thoughts. Let's pray. Father, I just thank you for each of these men. I thank you for this time that we've had together today. I thank you for the truth of who you are. And God, I thank you for who you've called us to be. I thank you that you don't just call us to it and give us the standard, but you guide us by your Spirit. You give us provision through your word. You give us provision through others. So I pray that you would continue to align our thinking, continue to align our living, continue to align who we are with more of who you are. And we love you. We thank you. I pray blessing on each one as they go. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.